Hey there, I'd just like to ask before the video starts, if you like what you see, please give us a click on the like and subscribe buttons. Hello, I'm Karl Wells. My guest today is an author and educator. He has a very keen interest in the history of Newfoundland and Labrador and its people. A while back, I picked up a book that he'd written about a Newfoundlander by the name of Joseph Kearney, and it looked really interesting, and I thought, you folks might like to know about Joseph Kearney and his adventures. The book is called Joseph Kearney and the Hunt for Rommel. And it was written with the assistance of Donna Kearney Adams. My guest is the author, Mr. Frank Galgay. Welcome, Frank.
Delighted to be here, Karl.
Delighted to have you here.
Yes.
Frank, I want to ask first, during the 1930s and the lead up to the Second World War, Europe was roiling, the fascism was on the rise,
exactly.
Not only in Germany but in Italy and Spain, and
Yes.
there was an awful lot of talk about war and the possibility of another
Yes.
world war,
Yes.
which I guess horrified a lot of people, having lived through the First World War. So what I'd like to ask is this. Joseph Kearney was very keen to get involved in the war. His father had fought in World War I.
Yeah.
This must have been something that, almost tormented his father, the idea that his son was so keen to get involved in this new war.
Yes. Well, Karl, it was a pleasure doing the book with Donna Kearney Adams, his daughter, as we could put it, the co-author of the book. And it was a real joy doing it. It had to be told, the story of an ordinary man who did an extraordinary thing. You mentioned there about his father. Of course, he was a World War I veteran, a blue puttee, who went overseas and saw action in Suvla. He was wounded, terribly wounded, suffered his whole life. And of course, Joe was very much affected by that. And he was a great admirer of his dad. And he had this feeling that he had to follow his footsteps. His father had served in World War I, and of course, World War II, Joe had to step up.
So he kind of wanted to do his dad proud, I suppose.
Exactly. He wanted his dad to be proud of him. Of course, the war started on September the 3rd, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, and of course they had a pact and Britain came into the war.
Now, he was 18 when he signed up.
Exactly.
You had to be older than that, didn't
Exactly. The regulations at the time stipulated that you had to be at least 20 years old. What Joseph did, he faked his birth certificate, and he got in, and he enlisted in the first 400. The Department of Natural Resources, where he worked, gave him permission to enlist, and they also put the guarantee there that on his return from the war that he would get his job back.
Now, let's talk about that first group that went over. We obviously suffered tremendous losses during the First World War, and we weren't as prepared or as able to answer the call, so to speak, as we were in the First World War. And yet we did, but the group was known as the First 400. Tell me about the first 400.
Okay, the first 400, Joe Kearney was number 50 of that particular group. And they enlisted in the Royal Artillery. As you just mentioned, we took an awful pounding financially, economically in World War I because the colony at the time raised the regiment, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, and they also paid for it. I think it cost roughly 15 million, and by 1930 it had risen, and that's a lot of money in those days, it had risen to $30 million to pay for pensions and also to pay for debts on loans that the colony had taken out at the time. And of course the powers that be and the Commission of Government at the time and the general public didn't want Newfoundland to go in debt again.
Now, once Joseph got over there, he documented what was happening to him in letters to his mother. Can you tell us something about the tone of these letters and exactly what he was describing to his mother?
Yes. Well, as you mentioned, these letters were passed on, by the way, by Joe's mother to the daughter, Donna Kearney Adams, who I just mentioned that we did the book together. There was approximately 140 letters, and they spanned a period from the time that he left the railway station in the West End of St. John's to Port aux Basques to North Sydney on the ferry, and then from North Sydney they went to St. John, New Brunswick, boarded the Duchess of Richmond, which was a luxurious boat converted into a troop ship, and they also were accompanied by other soldiers from other parts of Canada. They landed in Liverpool, and they were met by the mayor, Mayor Jones, and they were met by Sir Anthony Eden, who was in the British cabinet at the moment.
Later became a prime minister.
He later became Prime Minister of Britain. I won't quote it verbatim, but Eden gave this rousing speech that how Newfoundlanders, from the time of the Tudors right up to World War I, stood man to man in fighting the enemy. And of course, this was a terrible time. Hitler's fascist Germany, with their allies, of course, the Italians, were creating havoc in Europe and actually winning the war at the beginning.
So he was assigned to a British regiment, or
yes?
How did that work?
When they left Newfoundland, they went to England as the Royal Artillery, the recruits. When they were in England, they were formed into the when they got registered and so on. They were formed into the 57th Newfoundland Heavy Regiment Royal Artillery, their distinctive unit.
So they kept their Newfoundland identification.
They kept their Newfoundland identification, exactly. Yeah. And of course, Britain, or Great Britain at the time, would be footing the bill for these particular units.
So when France fell, they weren't sent, his regiment wasn't sent to France, they were sent to the coast of England.
Yes.
Why?
Well, Churchill was very concerned, and rightly so, that England was going to be attacked, which eventually it was, the Blitz of London and all around the southern coast of England. He was very fearful on the defensive of the Nazis and Hitler conquering, Great Britain or England there at the time. So their priority at the time for this contingent, the powers that be, was for them to do anti-aircraft duty on the coast of England. Now, Joe and them weren't too fussy or happy about that, because like the World War I, these young soldiers were leaving. They wanted to get into battle, right, and do their thing. And in the beginning, they ended up doing guard duty at Edinburgh Castle. So Joe and them, thought, why, we're ready to go to the continent, right, to do our thing. So they took anti-aircraft training, and they ended up in a place, Norfolk, in India. Not India, in England. Yes.
So at a certain point, he is chosen, one of the chosen few, to become a British commando.
Exactly.
And this was something new, wasn't it?
Yes. This was exciting. Its genesis, Sir Winston Churchill, by the way, and thank God for Churchill at that time in history.
Yeah.
So Winston Churchill stood up in the House of Commons and he said, we have to go on the offensive. You had Belgium and France falling. You had the British Expeditionary Force moving out from Dunkirk in France. So we were losing. They were on the defensive. So Churchill wanted to set up an elitist commando group that would go on the offensive to bring the war to the Germans and to slow them down. So this 11 Scottish commando group, something similar to the American SEALs, they were the crackerjack group. And he was in Norfolk at the time with the 57th Newfoundland Heavy Regiment, Joe was, and he, amongst hundreds of other people, signed up to join the 11 Scottish crackerjack commandos. He and 4 other Newfoundlanders were selected, and he was delighted. So that's how he ended up in
he ended up being part of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force.
Exactly.
And sees action for the first time, I believe, in Syria, correct?
Exactly.
And that was pretty vicious fighting,
yes.
Wasn't it?
Yes. I think my memory serves me correctly, June the 9th, 1941, the commandos were given their orders to go in and reclaim a bridge on the Litani River in Syria, to take it back from the Vichy French. Now people say, who were the Vichy French? They were allies of Adolf Hitler and the fascist Germany. They were their allies. They had claimed this bridge. It was a vital importance for the Australians were coming in, and the Allies, they needed that to be reclaimed. Joe and the commandos landed. They had 11 watercraft that came in on the beach, and they had a fight out on the beach with the enemy. They only there on the beach lost 1 man. However, in the battle itself, and I'll just describe that, they eventually lost 123 men, the commandos, plus their commanding officer, Petter. 2 things of interest for Joe and the 4 Newfoundlanders. Number 1, they were involved in taking a gun battery on a hill using Tommy guns and grenades. They took out the Vichy French. Number 2, they captured the headquarters of the Vichy French, the enemy. When they did that particular battle there, they pulled down the Vichy flag that was flying and hoisted up the Union Jack and the Free French flag. So, but that was their baptism of fire.
It had an effect on him too, because he wrote his father.
Yes.
And he said, "Don't show this letter to Mom."
Exactly.
And he admitted to his father that he thought he might get killed.
Exactly. I think at that time, philosophically or in his mind, he became conscious with this vicious battle that he could have been one of them. And therefore he reflected. He mentioned in the letter, my memory serves me correctly, that, you know, he could have been one of them, right? And anyhow, he says, you know, if I'm going to die, it's going to be somewhere. He gets nonchalant about it. He writes his father and said, death could come to me at any time. But he said, I would have one regret, that I didn't have the opportunity to thank you, Dad, for all that you did for me and for Mom. And he left instructions, please don't show this letter to Mom or my co-workers at the Department of Natural Defense. After that, by the way, that Litani Bridge in Syria, the other 4 Newfoundlanders went back to their unit, and Joe was the only one left from Newfoundland in the commandos.
Then comes the part which we see in the title of the book.
Yes.
This legendary bit of history connected with the Desert War, this special raid. How did that come about, and what part did Joe play in it?
Well, it was in November of 1941, and the commandos were given a mission to take Rommel out in the desert in North Africa.
And we should tell people who Rommel was.
Rommel was a famous German general, and he was called the Desert Fox. He was a brilliant strategist and very much respected and feared, but he was a gentleman soldier. So Winston Churchill stood up in the House of Commons and he said, I have great admiration for that gentleman who's creating havoc, right? Churchill personally admired him, respected him. And, you know, he was a decent man, really, although he was the enemy, a decent man. Of course, eventually he, you know, fell out with Hitler and he committed suicide, but a very fine gentleman. So what happened is Joe and them and the commandos were given their orders to go in and take Rommel out and to create havoc and to blow up their munitions and their you know, equipment and so on, and stall the advance. In the meantime, Joe and the commandos had to get in 250 miles inside of the German lines, which was unbelievable. Some of the German, you know, admirals, and not admirals, but generals and so on, really thought they parachuted in. They only, after the war, they couldn't believe what they did. But anyhow, what they did, they left Alexandria in lorries, they called them. Lorries, we know, trucks.
That's right, yeah.
In the trucks. And they went and boarded the HMSC Medway, who had serviced the you know, submarines. Then they got into 2 submarines, the HMS Talisman, and believe this or not, Joe ended up in the HMS Torbay.
Wow.
These were, did he know? He absolutely knew nothing about what he was doing. Neither did the rest of the commandos. This was so airtight.
Top secret.
Top secret. Top secret. So they get into submarines, and of course, they were sleeping on the floor. They were sleeping on the torpedo racks. The air was stale. It was cramped quarters. And off they went. And towards the end of November, or middle of November, they ended up in North Africa, off North Africa,
yeah,
to proceed with the mission they were doing. And they came in, and they had a lot of difficulty because of weather. In fact, the Talisman became grounded, And they lost some men, by the way, from the dinghies and the boats and so on. But they made it to the beach.
And when they finally got to Rommel's headquarters, then it turned into a bit of a fiasco, didn't
yes.
it?
And before they got to Rommel's headquarters, they had a terrific amount of rain. They were soaked. So, and 3 times, and going up some of the escarpments and sliding down, they were up to their ankles in mud. They were soaked. They were carrying backpacks with gelinite and explosives and everything that they were going to use. Then when they get in, it took them 3 or 4 days to get into Rommel's headquarters. And when they got there, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Keyes shot one of the guards, the German guards. Then they got in their headquarters and a firefight took place. And the young Keyes, the Lieutenant Colonel Keyes, was killed. Joe and them entered with pistols drawn, and some of the other commandos. A firefight took place, and one of the Captain Campbell, one of the commandos who spoke perfect German, was wounded. So the whole thing was not successful. They had to retreat.
So they headed back to the beach, hoping to make it to the submarine so they could escape, but didn't.
No, they couldn't get on the submarines because of weather. And when they went back, they were attacked. So Laycock, their commander, who was there, said to them, look, your best bet, gentlemen, is to break up into small groups and you're on your own. Try to get to the British lines. Joe Kearney and 6 others went or left as a group and headed towards a place called Tobruk, T-O-B-R-U-K. Their clothes, they were soaked. They had enough rations for 1 person for 2 days. They had 10 bars of chocolates, and they had a few rounds of ammunition. That's what they had. In the daytime, it was sweltering heat. In the nighttime, you know, the weather situation, it was freezing. So they were in bad shape. Then they suddenly came near a village called McKillie. And in that village, of course, was an Italian fort. The Italians, Mussolini and so on, were allies of the Germans. Then they noticed, or they were confronted with, the gates open up, and out comes the motorcyclists and mounted Breda guns and, you know, coming towards Kearney and his other commandos. So they said, boys, this is the end of it. We have to give up and surrender. We can't take them on. So they were taken then as a prisoner of war.
So he ends up in a prison for years, I guess.
Yes. Well, when they were, I'd like to put in here, when they were captured, of course, they were in commando clothes. They weren't in military uniforms. And the Geneva Convention, they had no obligation to them. They could be summarily executed. But Rommel heard of the great bravery of these men and so on, so he let it be known that they would be prisoners of war. So in Libya, they were prisoner of war, or he was, and some of the others. But Kearney himself went from 1941 to 1945, 3.5 years as a prisoner of war. I think it amounted to roughly 1,200 days. He ended up in North Africa. They shipped him over to various concentration camps in Italy and in Austria.
And was he eventually released, or did he escape?
Well, he suffered greatly in these prisoner of war camps, but he finally escaped. He had a number of times he tried to escape, and they caught him. And I think in the last one, they put him in a Gestapo camp, prisoner of war camp, and they put him in solitary confinement. This man really suffered physically and emotionally, unbelievably so. But the last time he escaped, he was in a camp near Vienna, and he and some others marched 50 miles towards the Americans who were advancing into Austria and then eventually German. The Americans, they met the Americans, so they took him under their wing. The Americans did, took care of him. They sent him to England to get medically checked and so on and so forth.
So what kind of a reception did Joseph Kearney receive when he returned to St. John's?
Well, before he returned, he went to Scotland to visit Dan and Mary Crawford. He had befriended them while he was a soldier, and he went to visit them, and then he went to London, and he had some time, free time and so on. Then he came home to St. John's. There was no brass band or great fanfare for him, but he was a hero to his family, his wife, and not his wife then, but to his family and his co-workers at the Department of Natural Resources and the friends within that particular area of Livingston Street.
Frank, this is a great story, and if folks want to read about Joe Kearney, I recommend you do. It's all in this book, Joseph Kearney and the Hunt for Rommel. Thanks for being my guest.
It's a pleasure today. Thank you very much.
See you again next time.